Hi, I'm David Shipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Two reporters. Start now. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Danny. How are you doing?
Great, thanks. And our mission today is to learn how to speak English better and write it better. I know I can sure use the help.
And to give us that help, Bryan Garner joins us again. He's one of the best-known experts on grammar in America. Bryan, welcome back.
Well, thank you.
And Bryan, let me say to our listeners first that we hope you heard our last episode with Bryan. He's written dozens of books about grammar and English usage, including Garner's Modern English Usage. It's now in its 5th edition, all 1,306 pages of it. Bryan's also editor of the Chicago Guide to Grammar, Usage, and Punctuation.
No, I'm author of that.
Author, sorry.
Yeah.
And in another life, and I say that because I don't know how you have time for all this, Bryan is also the author of Black's Law Dictionary. I mean, you see that on pretty much every lawyer's shelf in the United States. Bryan, you've been trying to convince lawyers for years that they should write in plain, understandable English. Are you a glutton for punishment?
Well, my basic point is the same as a point that Einstein made a century ago. Einstein said that his goal in expressing any idea was to make it as simple as possible, but never to oversimplify. And that's why plain English is actually far from dumbing down. Plain English is a very high intellectual attainment, and it takes real knowledge to know how far can you go in simplifying, let's say, a legal text without losing the legal meaning. That takes a very knowledgeable lawyer to be able to do it.
And we'd like to talk to you about legal writing. Boy, do we all wish lawyers could write in plain English. We're going to get to that, but we have some other issues that we'd like to raise with you as we go along here.
We want to continue what we started in part 1 in our last episode, which is we want to ask you about some of the grammar issues that bug us.
Sure.
Dave, why don't you start?
Well, one of the things that bugs me, and this is probably dates from the fact that I got grammar with my mother's milk. My mother was an English teacher, by the way, so that was part of it. And for me, there are a couple of issues. One is like versus as. Some years ago, during my last years working for the New York Times, the Times actually adopted a policy of using like to mean such as. So when you would write, several countries are providing weapons to Ukraine, they would want you to say like Germany, France. It grated on me, and I used to create constructions that would avoid it because I wanted to say such as. What's your feeling about that and how that's developed?
And Dave scolded me about this morning. I say like instead of such as all the time because I think it's more, conversational.
Yes. Most editors today don't object to like for such as. And people like Oprah use that expression all the time. I think I tend to use that like, but there are other uses of like that are also controversial. There is, of course, the old like versus as distinction. Cigarettes taste good like a cigarette should.
Wow, I remember that ad from the 1950s. I'd be watching my parents' black and white television.
Try Winston, America's most popular filter cigarette. Winston tastes good like a cigarette should.
Using the word like as a conjunction was considered very controversial in the middle of the 20th century. And people objected to that Winston cigarettes commercial, which today nobody would object to that.
I would object to it. Yeah.
Okay. I call it not fully acceptable. But then there is the universal use of like as a kind of filler word where some people cannot get through a sentence without a couple of likes.
We've been friends for like 11 years.
And then I was like, hello? And I was like, please, can I have my ticket?
I'm always weird about they wanted to watch it together. And I was like, well, I don't want to sit there.
As opposed to I said or I thought. But that does seem to be generational. As you'd agree with that, wouldn't you? It's generational.
Well, Bryan, for listeners who didn't hear our last episode, please brief them on your 5-point scale and tell us where like is on that scale.
I have what is called the Language Change Index. This is an index that I devised to assess correctness or levels of correctness And stage 5 is full acceptance. Stage 1 is not acceptable at all by standards of standard written English. Stage 1 is a blunder. Stage 2 is a blunder that has begun to spread, and quite a few people are doing it, but it's not considered good English. Stage 3, it is probably quite common in colloquial English, but it wouldn't find its way into print. And as I say, it changes over time. An example is something that Anderson Cooper does all the time on CNN, is he will say, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that good of a performance, as opposed to it's not that good a performance. It's not that big a deal. And I somehow believe that Anderson Cooper's mother would not have accepted it's not that big of a deal, as opposed to it's not that big a deal. How tall a building is this? Good English. Traditionally, not good English. How tall of a building is that? So it's called the intrusive of. But language changes. And so Anderson Cooper may have single handedly moved the needle from stage 2 to stage 3 on that intrusive of.
Everybody gets older. It's not that big a deal.
It's not that big a deal.
Not that big of a deal.
It's not that big of a deal.
And if we get to stage 4, stage 5 is probably sure to follow in a matter of decades.
And what's another issue you're pondering these days?
Now, somebody just tweeted yesterday about a lead article in the New Yorker. New Yorker, believe it or not, I think it was the very first paragraph of the first article in the March 13th New Yorker, misused whomever for whoever.
Ah.
Oh, my heavens. The world is really going downhill.
Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah. Mary Norris, where are you? The best copy editor in the United States is no longer at the New Yorker, and look what happens.
Well, maybe you should explain the difference, Bryan, could you?
I can. Whoever and whomever, the basic distinction is who is a subject, whom is an object. It can be an object of a preposition or an object of a verb. So, whom were you referring to? Now, you could say this in a very hyper-formal way. To whom were you referring? William Safire took the position that you should never use whom, that you should just always use who.
And just a quick interjection for listeners who don't know, William Safire had a popular language column in the New York Times Magazine.
And in fact, colloquially, we will tend to say, who were you referring to? And only a pedant, only an insufferable pedant would object to who were you referring to in speech and say, oh, no. You must say, whom are you referring to? I mean, come on, that's kind of bothersome. On the other hand, nobody would say, for who the bell tolls. After a preposition, we tend to use the whom form, and whom is more durable than people have thought. I mean, for 200 years, people have been announcing the so-called demise of whom, but it is not dying. It is staying, especially in American English. Now, there are difficult questions that come up, and this was a difficult one in the New Yorker. Let me just see if I can find the example.
No rush. We're not going to any movies.
It's a good thing this isn't live. Okay, so here is the sentence. It's in Talk of the Town. Brett Baer asked all the candidates on stage if they would endorse the eventual Republican nominee, comma, whomever that might be.
Oh, ouch.
Now, that should be whoever that might be. Because it's a linking verb, it's taking what is called by grammarians a predicate nominative. But you can see it's a little bit tricky because some people say would endorse the eventual Republican nominee. The eventual Republican nominee is the object of endorse. And so, comma, whoever that might be, they tend to think that's the object of endorse, but it's not. It's a new clause that takes a predicate nominative. It's a tricky little point.
Yeah, I'd say it's more than tricky for me. It's complicated.
Let me give you another example, though. I want to see whoever is responsible. I want to see whoever is responsible. I want to see whomever is responsible. Now, that's an interesting little problem. Some people will say it's the object of see. Whoever, I want to see whomever. I want to see whoever. Well, if you just left it at that, you would say whomever. I want to see whomever. But The tricky thing about this is whoever is responsible is a clause, and every finite verb like is requires a subject, and whoever is responsible, whoever is the subject of is. It's a tricky little point.
Well, let me ask you one of my pet peeves. I only like chocolate and espresso ice creams. Do I have to say I like only chocolate ice cream?
I tend to be fastidious about the placement of only. There's a tendency in American English and in British English alike to move only up in the sentence way before what it's actually modifying. I only like chocolate ice cream. I only like it. I don't love it. I don't detest it. I only like it. It's using only a little bit early in the sentence. It's common in colloquial English. It is something that some editors care a good deal about, but I'm afraid that's probably, close to stage 5.
Well, I'm with you, Brian, on that one. And when I teach writing, I really try to get students to place only right before the word it modifies, because there are situations in which the meanings can be different. So Bob only ran to the store on Tuesday. Well, he only ran. He didn't walk or drive. He went only to the store. He went only on Tuesday. I mean, all of those have different meanings depending on where only appears in the sentence.
Gentlemen, if I've been helping dumb down the language, I apologize. Yeah, and just to remind our listeners, we're talking with Bryan Garner. His Garner's Modern English Usage, more than 1,300 pages long, is now in its 5th edition. And he's written dozens of other books about how to speak English and write it.
Now, you mentioned the problem of the pedant being too picky. And one of the issues that comes to mind when you mention that is the rule that's not really a rule of not ending a sentence with a preposition. I remember reading a quote that went something like this: "This is the sort of nonsense up with which I will not put."
It's commonly attributed to Winston Churchill, but it is now thought to be wrongly attributed to Churchill. It's sort of an apocryphal story. In Latin, a preposition is prepositioned. That's where we get the word from.
Ah.
It's prepositioned. It appears before the word it modifies. And in Latin, a preposition cannot end a sentence. And so when we were first beginning to have English grammars, and the first major English grammar was 1711. Now, the interesting thing is there was no reputable 18th century grammarian who said in print that it's a grammatical error to end a sentence with a preposition. There was one grammarian named Robert Lowth in 1762 who said it may not be the best syntax, but he said it only because you want a very emphatic word at the end of a sentence, and a preposition usually is not that. Lowth's mere hesitation about ending a sentence with a preposition became a hardened stance in the 19th century, and this was taught pretty much through about 1900. Fowler's first book on grammar was called The King's English, dated 1906, and he was at some pains to say this is a superstition. And so have all the 20th century writers. That sometimes you're given a choice. You can either be a stuffed shirt or you can be natural. You're given a choice between a hyper formal construction, Jane is a person to whom it is worth listening, very formal, or Jane is a person worth listening to, which is much more natural English. Yeah, you can end a sentence with a preposition. It is often not the most emphatic word to put at the end of a sentence, but sometimes the feel for the language should guide you against taking these hyper formal constructions and putting them in your own prose.
By the way, you've just made my day with that. Thank you very much. I love ending sentences with prepositions. I regret to say that even loved ones of mine, younger ones, but not terribly younger, are now saying, her and I are going to the movie.
Yeah, or me and you are going to the store. Well,
Bryan Garner is shaking his head sadly, I see.
Now, I had an intern who said to me and my buddies are going to go play golf or something like that. Me and my buddies. No, my buddies and I. So as the subject of a sentence, it should be I. But I think what happened was that that was so common. Even I grew up saying things like, me and Brad are fixing to play golf. And my father corrected that out of me rather routinely, had to. But now a lot of people are starting to use I when it's an object, especially if it follows another noun. So if you say, in good English, traditional English, please come see my partners and me. You leave your partners out of it, you would say, please come see me. You would never say, please come see I. But otherwise, educated people have started saying, and I recently heard the president of an Ivy League university say this in an interview, please come see my colleagues and I.
Whoa.
It should be my colleagues and me. Yeah, but the president of a very prestigious university saying that, it's kind of shocking. That would have been unthinkable.
You don't want to name names?
Well, I'm not going to bring up. Well, actually, no, I'm not going to name names.
Okay.
So where on your chart is this now? Her and me are going. And
Her and me are going would be probably stage 1, stage 2, maybe. But please come see my colleagues and I. That's probably stage 3. But you are hearing more and more educated people use that in speech. 20 years ago, it was common to say, please come see my colleagues and myself. But I'd rather see myself there than the wrong pronoun I or me, wouldn't you?
Yes.
but I hear this all the time. People saying her and I are going.
Danny, I just don't know who you're hanging out. I don't know I don't know whom you're hanging around with. With whom are you hanging around, Danny? My goodness.
I'm not going to divulge any names.
Yeah, I have some others of these pet peeves, which I could throw out. Fewer versus less, for example. That really sets my teeth on edge.
And how about amount versus number? It's a related problem. Less goes with non-count nouns, less salt, but fewer grains of salt. Nowadays, you are hearing people say what amount of people were there, as opposed to what number of people were there or how many people were there. Well, you could say the amount of sand, the number of grains of sand, but you wouldn't say the amount of grains of sand. It's a little bit strange.
So fewer, you use fewer for something you can count. There were fewer cars today and less for something you can't quantify. Is that right? There's less traffic.
Fewer cars and less traffic. Yes. And there are people who prefer to shop in grocery stores that say for the express lane 10 items or fewer, and boycott stores that say 10 items or less. So
You can go hungry doing that.
let all the grocery store chains take note. But the language is changing, and here we are watching it change. And I think there's nothing wrong with objecting to these changes and doing everything you can to fight against linguistic change that you think is retrograde. But in the end, we have to be realists. And when it reaches stage 5, you have to say, well, it's okay.
It seems to me that it's a question also of precision of thinking, because language can be precise or very sloppy. So when you mix up amount and number, or fewer and less, you really are suggesting an imprecise way of thinking about a particular issue, countable or not countable. It does kind of suggest a certain muddy way of looking at things. I mean, there's a certain...
David, you wear your fogeydom with pride. You really do. And almost every time language changes, there's an argument to be made that people are blurring a useful distinction. For example, peruse. Peruse has traditionally meant to read with great care. But suddenly, a few decades ago, people started using peruse to mean to glance at superficially.
Uh-oh, that's what I do.
Exactly the opposite of what it has traditionally meant. And nonplussed is another one. Nonplussed traditionally meant confused. She was completely nonplussed. But in the last couple of decades, people have begun using nonplussed to mean unfazed. which is almost exactly the opposite meaning, just completely unfazed. Well, that's not the traditional meaning of nonplussed at all. So if somebody mistakenly perceives the traditional meaning of a term and then starts using it and it kind of catches on, and then you get a whole segment of society using a word to mean kind of the opposite of what people have traditionally thought it meant, you have an interim period of genuine confusion. And some people will say, well, this is all very trivial. I mean, who cares? But to some of us who do care about text and tradition and how language has traditionally grown up and been used, it is disconcerting.
Well, you want to get into legal writing, Danny? Because this is a fascinating area too.
Totally. Yeah, because one of your missions is that you have been trying to convince lawyers around the country that you can and you should write plain, simple English that everybody can understand, instead of writing the gobbledygook that we all have seen in legal writing, where we think, I have no idea what this guy's talking about.
Well, it's true. And there's an age old tradition. George Coode in 1842 was saying that the best legal English is in ordinary idiomatic language that people can readily understand. I mean, there are various theories about why lawyers have used this jargon that we call legalese. What is it exactly? Is it to keep everyone else in the dark and to perpetuate their own sense of importance? Is it that we have a tradition of precedent and the way it's been done before happens to be very important to lawyers and they want to repeat the way things have been done before? And so there are, some very strange examples of almost Elizabethan English that have been enshrined and are still occasionally used in American jurisdictions. Doth and hath and burthen instead of burden, which you find in Shakespeare. But it's very strange to find this in a 20th century judicial opinion. Of course, it goes way beyond that to the length of sentences and a lot of highfalutin jargon that is simplifiable. If you can say something with no change in meaning and you can say it more simply, then you ought to. A good example is herein. Lawyers are full of here and there words, thereof, therein, hereby. Now, the interesting thing about herein is that it is not just legalese, it is also imprecise and it causes ambiguities because courts have held that herein can mean in this agreement, or it can mean in this paragraph, or it can mean in this sentence, it can mean in this provision, it can mean in this section, it can also mean in this series of related documents. So herein is inherently, believe it or not, ambiguous.
Wow, that's fascinating.
And lawyers say they use legalese, because it's so precise, much, much more precise. No, that's not true. Legalese is not more precise, as David Mellenkopf showed in a very important 1963 book called The Language of the Law. It is typically less precise and often ambiguous and very problematic.
And why do you think that so many lawyers write this way? Is it because they want to pass the buck, basically, when they write up a contract or write a law? In other words, if they write gobbledygook, it's sort of like saying, hey, let's let other lawyers fight over about what this really means someday off in the future.
Or are they taught that in law school? They're taught how to write that way in law school.
Well, actually, almost every law school has a good legal writing program in which they're taught to write in good, straightforward, simple English. But because the way we teach law is in case books with old precedents and old, 19th century judicial opinions, and even earlier, regardless of what they learn in legal writing, they are learning through the rest of the curriculum that really, if you want to sound like a lawyer, this is what you ought to sound like, some 19th century or 18th century passage.
Well, here's what a lawyer said to me once. I hired him to threaten to sue a developer who was going to take down a bunch of trees right next to our house. So he came up with a legal settlement, which the developer eventually signed. And I said to the lawyer, wait a minute, I feel like I'm at least of average intelligence. I can't understand this contract, this legal settlement you've drawn up. Can't you just write it in plain old English so that everybody can understand it. And he said, well, here's the problem. Over, decades and decades of court decisions, certain phrases, no matter how complicated they seem to you, have come to be interpreted as meaning X or Y. And therefore, we have to keep using them. And you're totally shaking your head no.
That's a fallacy. That is absolutely a fallacy. That view says you cannot trust words to mean what they mean, and you have to hold in your mind the entire case law of a given jurisdiction. I actually know a lawyer who used to argue that you should use shall in a given provision. One of the things I teach is not to use shall in transactional documents. He argues that no, the Texas Supreme Court decided in 1988 that what shall means is may.
Shall means may?
Yeah.
Seriously.
Oh, every jurisdiction in the world has holdings that shall can mean may. I'll explain it in a moment. His argument was that this has been litigated. It's been litigated to the highest court in Texas, and we all know what shall means in this provision. It definitively means may because there's a court decision on it. So you have to use shall because it means may. In about 5% of the sentences that you find in modern contracts, something like that, shall means may. And in every state in the union, shall has been held to mean may. If you say, wait a second, why not just use may? He would argue, I don't know what that means. It's never been litigated.
I'm totally confused. I thought shall meant you must do that. You shall do that. So does shall actually mean may or may not?
No. Shall normally expresses a duty.
That's what I thought.
And I recommend not using shall. Shall is one of the most litigated words in the English language. Shall has been held by courts to mean should, may, is, will, all these things. And so once you start actually drafting, there's a tendency for some transactional lawyers to think that shall is the drafting verb and they just use it in every sentence in a contract or a rule or a regulation. No state shall. Does that mean no state is required to do something? No. Now, before signing on to this podcast, let's assume you had a confidentiality agreement that you made me sign, that nothing that occurs that isn't ultimately decided to be played for this podcast am I able to disclose to anyone else. Let's just assume that. And you have a contractual provision that says neither party shall disclose the substance of anything that was said but not broadcast. Neither party shall disclose. You say, oh, it's mandatory. What is the meaning of shall? Let's say it's mandatory. Let's say it means is required to. Or let's say it means has a duty to. Neither party shall disclose. Neither party has a duty to disclose. Neither party is required to disclose. And let's say I called the Wall Street Journal and I told them all about this podcast and things that were not broadcast. And you say, hey, Bryan, you were supposed to do that. I said, what are you talking about? It says neither party shall disclose. Neither party has a duty to disclose. And I could argue, well, I was delighted not to be duty bound to disclose this. I did it voluntarily. I don't know what you're upset about. Because what you actually mean there is neither party is allowed to disclose. Neither party may disclose. You're negating permission to do it. You're not negating a duty to do it. It is a mushy, mushy word. And part of the reason is we don't use shall in ordinary English. Americans don't use it except in two expressions. We shall overcome and shall we dance. That's about it. For most people, they don't use shall at all.
And here I would just like to say my mind is now in knots.
But what I'd like to know, Bryan, is how do you train lawyers? I know you've written about this and tried to convey the idea that legal writing ought to be straightforward and clear. But do you actually hold training sessions with lawyers? Do you try to teach them how to do this?
I do it every week of the year.
Really?
Just about, except in late December. But yes, I, in 1991, founded a company, I guess it was actually late 1990, called Law Pros Incorporated. And most of my teaching today, even though I do hold the title Distinguished Research Professor of Law at SMU Law School, Southern Methodist University, I am mostly training lawyers and judges how to write better, more powerfully, more precisely. I do seminars all around the country every week of every year.
Do the lawyers you train resist?
No. In fact, it's interesting. The most receptive audiences that I have are typically judges.
Ah,
The next in line, I would say, are senior partners. And the next in line are junior partners. The most resistant people that I encounter, if I can generalize, are new graduates from law school. People who are just fresh out of law school are the most resistant and often the most wedded to legalese. It's a very interesting thing. But I think it's because, you know, they've spent so much money on their legal education. They're heavily in debt, many of them. They carry these big student loans and they still have a lot to learn. They don't want to acknowledge that.
so speaking of lawyers and judges, I want to ask Dave. Dave, are you okay with this? I want to ask you a little quiz that I heard Bryan give at a talk last year. And I'm hoping you're going to get it wrong. I sure did. Is that correct, by the way? I sure did.
That's certainly good colloquial English, but I suppose some people would say, I surely did.
Yes, surely, for surely.
I should probably stop speaking right now or I'll make another grammatical mistake. Anyway, okay, moving right along to our quiz. Dave, which of the following is correct? A, the Supreme Court is comprised of 9 justices. B, 9 justices comprise the Supreme Court. C, the Supreme Court comprises 9 justices.
C, the Supreme Court comprises 9 justices.
Oh my God, I can't believe you got that right.
That's correct, right?
You got it right, David.
Well, I guessed A, the Supreme Court is comprised of 9 justices. I'm kind of shocked, actually.
David is a snoot, the syntax nerd of our time.
So please explain that answer, Bryan.
Well, comprise has traditionally meant to include exclusively or to be made up of is the meaning of comprise. So the Supreme Court comprises 9 justices. The Supreme Court is made up of 9 justices. But, comprise is a word. It's a so-called word in transition. The other 2 sentences are probably stage 3.
Unbelievable. So, Bryan, before we go, do you want to mention one other thorny grammatical question that's been coming across your desk lately? Speaking of your desk, we should describe this office where you are. It's unbelievable.
Beautiful. It's like a library.
Yeah, it looks like you're in a part of the Library of Congress or something with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books beautifully arranged on the shelves.
Well, I'm in a room that has only sets of books. And this is my office. And this is where I do my teaching from. Here we have Words and Phrases, which is a 70-volume encyclopedia of litigated words. Here we have American jurisprudence and corpus juris secundum, and here's a complete set of Harvard Law Review. And what I've done is create this room that has sets of books. Each shelf is actually 2.5 times deep. So this, I'm pointing at one case of books. This would normally, floor to ceiling, take 2.5 of these cases, but it's all in one case because they're double shelved. In other words,
So there are books behind what we see?
yeah, it's double shelved. They're double
A
shelved.
shelf that pulls out, is that it? Or?
No, it's not even. It won't pull out. You just have to take off the front books and get behind to find the other volumes. But I can find whatever volume I'm looking for. If I know that I'm looking for volume 73 of the Supreme Court Reporter, I can easily find it. But there are 2.5 times as many books in this room as you actually see.
Oh, yikes. So how many books do you have?
I'm a little embarrassed to say, Danny, must I?
Please.
Well, I have 38,000 books.
Come on.
Yeah, I had to build this house specifically for my books. 17,000 volumes in one room, 12,000 volumes in a back building, and the rest of them here, downstairs and upstairs. 3 different libraries. But I collect antiquarian dictionaries, about 4,500 dictionaries, and about 2,000 English grammars. So as you can see, this is not some superficial, fleeting interest of mine. It's something I care deeply about.
So when somebody says, how do you know that in 1632 somebody wrote such and such, you can say, because I have the book right here in the library down the hall.
That happens with more frequency than you might think. People come into a big library like this and they say, have you read them all? Every serious book collector has to be prepared to answer that question, have you read them all? And my favorite answer is, some of them twice.
Bryan Garner, author of Garner's Modern English Usage, now in its 5th edition, and author of dozens of other books. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It was fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. You've been great. I've enjoyed it.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, or pretty much any leading podcast site. And we hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'm David Tripler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.